Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and a Take 5 for Florida History. This is the fourth video in my series exploring the St. Johns River. The river can be divided into three sections, and today I'm at the very end of the river at Huguenot Memorial Park. And spoiler alert, it ends at the Atlantic Ocean. At this point, it's about 310 miles or 499 kilometers from its start at Fort Drum Marsh. The first part was an introduction to the river, while the next two covered the upper and middle parts. I've chosen the lower part of the St. Johns to begin at the outflow of Lake George, about 100 miles or 160 kilometers upriver. Lake George is both the final and largest lake on the river, and after that point the St. Johns begins to spread out until it gets to Jacksonville, where it ends up narrowing as it winds through the city. The river only drops about 30 feet in its leisurely run to the ocean. Hopefully it's obvious since I'm very close to the Atlantic, but I'm just above sea level. This area has a significant indigenous population for thousands of years prior to the arrival of Europeans in the area. These barrier islands, such as this one, Fort George Island, have been wonderful places to live since humans first moved into the peninsula. We're not sure when that happened, but we have evidence that dates back to 14,000 years ago.
So this is part 4 of my series on the St. Johns River and how it relates to Florida's tourism history. You don't have to watch the previous ones before this one, but I hope you'll watch all of them eventually. The first is an introduction to Florida's most important river, and the other two cover the origins of the St. Johns and how it grows into maturity. This segment will cover the lower river, that part just north of Lake George from the city of Palatka to its mouth where it enters the Atlantic Ocean. This is about a 77-mile or 124-kilometer distance, which is about a quarter of the overall length of the river. So this is the shortest of the three sections. I'm going to discuss the towns of Palatka and Green Cove Springs, as well as Florida's most populous city, Jacksonville, the only large city on the St. Johns. I'll take a look at three attractions, two gardens, one that's now a state park and one that closed 64 years ago, as well as the second oldest zoo in the state. I'll cover a few additional interesting spots, such as Switzerland, a 20-foot alligator, two lighthouses, and the place where tourists would arrive before airplanes and cars were invented. While the upper St. Johns is mostly undeveloped and in some places about as wild as it was when William Bartram explored the area back in the 1770s, the lower part is quite the opposite. Sure, there's some natural areas, but much of it is tied to commercial pursuits and nature takes a back seat. There's some other notable differences. One is that the river is typically much wider, especially if you don't count the many shallow lakes the river passes through before it gets to Palatka. That's another difference, by the way. There's no lakes in this part, though much of it might feel as if you're on one. The river is about 2 to 4 miles or 3 to 8 kilometers wide between Palatka and where it reaches central Jacksonville. This means that there's a fair amount of commercial traffic here, especially in Jacksonville, which is the 14th largest U.S. container port. As you can see at the bottom right of this map, the St. Johns takes a few rather tight turns around the floodplain of the Horseshoe Point Conservation Area before it reaches Palatka and the Memorial Bridge. The city of 10,000 inhabitants was founded in the year that the U.S. took possession of Florida. The area had been settled by indigenous communities for much longer, and it gained the name Picolota by Seminoles, likely meaning cow crossing. By the time William Bartram reached the area in 1774, the name had become Palatka. When the U.S. settlers moved into the area in 1829, they continued to use the name. The I would be changed to an A in 1875. The settlement developed on the west side of the St. Johns. Regular ferry service was established across the river in 1826, which connected St. Augustine on the coast to the developing settlements to the west, notably Micanopy. By the 1850s, steamboats were regularly traveling down the St. Johns from Jacksonville, and Palatka quickly became the main port between Jacksonville and Sanford. Those steamboats brought settlers, furniture, livestock, tools, supplies, and tourists. Hotels were built in Palatka and other towns along the St. Johns so people could take advantage of the mild winters and healthy climate. Before and after the Civil War, Palatka grew in population and influence until 1884, when a massive fire destroyed much of the city. Due to the lack of hotels and stores, tourists began to visit other parts of the state. This was partly responsible for the change in fate of Palatka. Through the 20th century, it stayed small, barely growing to a city of just 10,000 people, while other cities such as Ocala and Gainesville grew into regional centers. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, federal government assistance was provided to Florida. Part of that assistance was provided by the Works Progress Administration and its predecessor, the Federal Emergency Relief Act. The WPA and FERA were comprised of millions of out-of-work men whom the government hired to create public works projects such as the roads, buildings, and cultural projects. Located just south of Palatka's historic downtown is one of the WPA's most interesting and unique projects. Known as Ravine Gardens, its construction began in 1933 and utilized two ravines that come together in a V shape. The ravines are a rather unusual geological formation. Over centuries, a spring-fed stream, known as Whitewater Branch, eroded the sand along its bed. Unlike typical river canyons that are created by erosion from the land's surface, these ravines were formed by water eroding the sand from underneath the surface. Eventually, the land above collapsed and created what are known as steep head valleys. Whitewater Branch slowly created the cuts in the ground, which are up to 120 feet or 37 meters deep. The 45-degree sloped walls were already covered with vegetation when the project commenced, but workers transformed the area by planting and replanting thousands of trees and bushes. The 152-acre or 62-hectare site was transformed through grading the stream bed, building rock stairs and wooden suspension bridges, creating nearly 2 miles of a ring road, and constructing an amphitheater made of rock-lined risers. The locals hoped that this would be Palatka's return to being a tourist destination, and it certainly helped, as Ravine Gardens was a popular site, especially in the spring when tens of thousands of azaleas and other flowers bloom. Whenever I talk about our next stop, the area known as Piccolata, people ask me if I meant Palatka. And yes, they're near each other, but they're not the same. While Piccolata was a river crossing, as was Palatka, Piccolata was further north and on the east side of the river. We know that both narrow points were used by indigenous people to cross the river, but Piccolata was also developed by the Spanish long before there was a ferry at Palatka. The Spanish built a tiny wooden fort at Picolata around 1700, though they had a ferry to cross the river before that, as they'd been creating El Camino Real, the Royal Road, in the 1680s. While that was little more than an ox cart path through the territory to reach Appalachia, which was near present-day Tallahassee, the ferry at Picolata was regularly used to take supplies to various missions along the road. Picolata's counterpoint was San Francisco de Pupo on the west side of the river. And no, I haven't learned where the names Picolata and Pupo come from. After the Spanish ceded control of the territory to the U.S., American commerce quickly began to use the river to get from the mouth of the St. Johns to Picolata to reach St. Augustine. Considering that by the start of the Civil War, Jacksonville had just about the same number of residents as St. Augustine, roughly 2,000, the much older city was an important destination for supplies, settlers, and tourists. Picolata was the first main stop south of Jacksonville. As can be seen from this illustration from Harper's Weekly in 1870, the dock and accommodations weren't lavish. It was around this time that rail lines were being laid throughout the area, but the importance of Picolata as a connection to St. Augustine would continue until 1888, when Henry Flagler had the first rail bridge built over the St. Johns, which would connect the nation's oldest city with the rest of the U.S. It shouldn't be a surprise that it was the same year Flagler's Ponce de Leon Hotel opened in St. Augustine, the first grand tourist hotel in Florida. Today, nothing of note remains of Piccolata. It never developed into a town itself, neither did its counterpart on the western shore. The location was near this historical marker, which is located at the end of County Road 208. As of 2022, the area is just a few homes along the river and the road. Just up the river, we find Green Cove Springs, about 6 miles or 10 kilometers from Piccolata. The spot was first settled in 1816 by a George Clark, who received a land grant from the Spanish and set up a sawmill, though an actual settlement didn't really develop until 1854. It was named WhiteSulfur Springs. The name is derived from a relatively small spring that flows out of the ground less than 500 feet or 150 meters from the St. Johns. For those who might be interested in the volume of water coming out of Florida's many springs, Green Cove is a relatively small one with a daily flow of 1.8 million gallons or 6.8 million liters. For comparison, Blue Springs' daily flow is 100 million gallons or 390 million liters. After decades of regularly visiting many of Florida's springs, I still find these numbers overwhelming. To provide a hopefully useful perspective, this is the main pool at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa. It holds 500,000 gallons, or 1.9 million liters. That means Green Cove Springs could fill this massive pool nearly 3 times a day. And yet, as you can see, it's really a tiny stream that flows to the river. Plus, it takes a rather interesting and historical path. As you walk towards the source of the stream, you quickly reach a small waterfall that pours over coquina rock brought in from the St. Augustine area. This waterfall is coming out of a slot in the wall that has a modern swimming pool on the other side. Now, the first time I saw this, I wasn't familiar with Green Cove Springs. I actually just found the park while I was exploring other parts of the town. While it looked like a stream was coming out of the pool, that didn't make sense. So I walked around the pool to see what was on the other side. There I found the origin of the spring. The spring head is contained in a small pool and the flow of water empties directly into the swimming pool. Intriguingly, this isn't a recent development. Sometime in the mid-19th century, the area was developed as a spa. Its original name, WhiteSulfur Springs, provides some information. The spring has a significant mineral content which purportedly had health benefits, though while there's sulfur in the water, it probably shouldn't be considered a sulfur spring. Sulfur springs are usually hot water springs that come from volcanic activity. It's that activity which creates the sulfur dioxide present in the water. Still, the spring was considered healthful even at 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. By 1866, the town was renamed Green Cove Springs and was incorporated in 1874. This stereoscope from at least 130 years ago shows an early bathing pool. Note that this is likely the spring head itself. By the turn of the century, the last century that is, a large casino had been built with the spring head left outside and its healthy flowing water pouring inside to an enclosed pool, complete with slide. By the way, the term casino had nothing to do with gambling. It's an Italian word that became to mean social club in the U.S. In the mid-20th century, it eventually changed to mean gambling house, while in Italy, it would become synonymous with brothel. Isn't language fun? Anyway, Green Cove Springs Casino was a popular destination for many years. Just prior to World War II, the casino would be demolished and a modern-style outdoor pool was created with a new building. The small waterfall that is the beginning of the stream was possibly created around the same time. Today, the pool is popular throughout the year, and no matter the air temperature, the water is a constant 78 degrees. To backtrack a bit, these days you get to Green Cove Springs from St. Augustine by crossing the St. Johns on the new Alvin G. Shands Bridge. It's a span of 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometers. Its span height tops out at 45 feet or 14 meters, but it wasn't the first bridge to cross here. In 1928, the first Shands Bridge was built. It was 2 miles or over 3 kilometers long and was a drawbridge. The remarkable thing was that this was a long wooden bridge, built of cypress and live oak with a pine roadbed. This was the only bridge between Jacksonville and Palatka, and like its replacement, it was built next to the bend in the river that was known as Green Cove for the tall evergreen trees that lined the shore. Named after local businessman Alvin Shands, it was he who got the original bridge built. He sold stock to pay for the $50,000 cost and charged around 50 cents for a bridge toll. Because of the Great Depression that would begin the next year, he never recouped his money. In 1934, the state purchased the bridge for half of the original price and removed the tolls. In 1950, part of the old bridge was destroyed by fire and rebuilt, but the bridge wasn't safe. Locals knew that the wooden guardrails weren't going to keep you on the bridge if you strayed even a bit. The new Alvin Shands Bridge was built in 1963, and the old bridge was turned into a fishing pier. Only a year after the new bridge opened, part of it was damaged by Hurricane Dora, and more recently it was damaged once again in 2018 by Hurricane Matthew. Matthew also destroyed much of the old bridge. There are current plans for yet another Shands Bridge to be built just south of the current aging span. The project, which will cost an estimated $763 million, will eventually replace the new bridge that's known by locals as the "a foot to the left, you're in the other lane, a foot to the right, and you're in the drink bridge." The new one will be 20 feet higher to equal the height of the other bridges on the river to allow for even more river traffic. Our next stop is Switzerland and the modern-day Alpine Groves Park. Established by 1774, it was named for the birthplace of the plantation's owner, Francis Philip Facio. Facio, his wife Maria, and their children emigrated from the Kingdom of Sardinia to British East Florida in 1771. He was an investor in 2 indigo plantations, and the New Switzerland was 10,000 acres or 40 square kilometers. New Switzerland was prosperous. Records show it was worked by 86 slaves and 4 free blacks. Facio even served as a staff officer in the British Army during the American Revolution. The explorer William Bartram was a guest of the plantation and wrote that Francis Facio was a very civil gentleman. At the end of the American Revolutionary War, when Florida was returned to Spain, Facio chose to stay in Florida. The New Switzerland plantation had one of the earlier commercial landings on the St. Johns, and ships regularly stopped to collect timber, citrus, cotton, wool, indigo, and corn. By the way, Francis and Maria's granddaughter, Maria Facio, would operate a boarding house in St. Augustine after the U.S. took possession of Florida. That establishment would become the Jimenez Facio House. I presented its history in this video. While the original plantation grew in size to be about 15,000 acres or 61 square kilometers, Alpine Groves Park is only 55 acres or 22 hectares. It was operated as a citrus grove in the 1800s, and the farmhouse dates from the 1880s. It would become known as the Bennett House from property owner Ruth Bennett, who would sell it to St. Johns County in 1999. The Switzerland name stuck to this still rural area in Florida long after the plantation had ceased operation, and Alpine Groves reflects that heritage. Just before the river narrows as it twists through downtown Jacksonville, I want to mention another early tourist attraction. Unlike Ravine Gardens, Oriental Gardens is no longer in operation, though a road still bears its name. The gardens got its start in 1925 when George Clark began creating a private botanical garden. In 1937, he opened it to the public, but died less than 2 years later. The park continued to operate, however, now managed by his son, George Clark Jr. He died in 1947, and the family closed Oriental Gardens in 1954, subsequently selling it to a developer who created a residential neighborhood. We've now entered Jacksonville, and here I want to take a look at a couple city parks on the banks of the St. Johns and what the area looked like some 90 years ago. I'm speaking of Memorial Park, created to honor Floridians who died in World War I, and Metropolitan Park, which was developed out of an urban landfill. These two public parks are great places to view the St. Johns, downtown Jacksonville, and several bridges. In Metropolitan Park is this rather striking statue, but its story isn't known by most of the people who visit the park. Firstly, the park is located across the street from Jacksonville's football stadium, currently called TIAA Bank Field. That stadium and its predecessor, Gator Bowl Stadium, are where the annual college football Gator Bowl game has been played since 1946. What's less well known is where the statue came from. That'd be an alligator farm attraction that operated just north of St. Augustine on US 1 until it closed in 1982. The statue, minus cigar, eventually made its way to Jacksonville. As you can see by these early photos from 1936, the river shore was filled with boat docks that made Jacksonville the largest seaport in Florida. Most of the docks were for companies that were transporting goods to and from Florida. Some of the docks serviced passenger lines, at first sailing boats and ships, but later steam-powered vessels. Likely the largest was the Clyde Steamship Company, which operated two separate lines. One offered ocean-going steamship trips between Jacksonville and many ports to the north, including Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The other offered steamboat trips that traveled along the St. Johns. The Clyde Line, and later the Clyde-Mallory Line, would take you from New England to Jacksonville and on to Green Cove Springs, Palatka, Astor, DeLand, Enterprise, and Sanford. The steamships shown in these images, Apache, Arapaho, Comanche, Huron, and Iroquois, were named for American indigenous tribes, as were many of their ships. They were each between 300 and 450 feet long. That'd be 90 to 137 meters, roughly the size of the Carpathia, the ship that rescued the survivors of the much larger Titanic. By the way, in 1925, the Comanche caught fire off of Mayport, close to the mouth of the St. Johns. The source of the fire is unknown, but out of 155 crew and passengers, only 8 suffered injuries and 1 was reported missing. It's unclear if he was ever found. Next, we'll look at the Jacksonville Zoo. I'm mostly mentioning it because it lies on the Trout River, and from the zoo's dock you can see where the Trout meets the St. Johns. It opened in 1914 and moved to its present site in 1925. This makes it the oldest zoo in Florida, other than the St. Augustine Alligator Farm. It's an attractive large zoo and has an interesting collection of animals. Between the Trout River and Ready Point, on the opposite side of the bank, the St. Johns makes its final turn to the east to make its slow run to the ocean. At this point, we're only about 3 miles or 5 kilometers from the end. We've now looked at 99% of the length of Florida's longest river, and here it's more seawater than fresh. Tankers, shrimp boats, barges, and cargo ships pass by 24 hours a day, along with naval ships and pleasure craft. Just east of Ready Point is the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. At 72 square miles, or 186 square kilometers, it's one of the largest federal properties in the state. Managed by the National Park Service, it was established in 1988, though one of its important sites, Fort Caroline National Memorial, was created in 1953. The Fort Caroline site includes a recreation of a fort the French military built in 1564, more than a year before the Spanish established St. Augustine. While this made it the first European settlement in Florida, it didn't last, because the Spanish would attack the fort in 1565, capture it, and would put nearly all the French to death. You can learn more about that event in this video. The replica fort sits on the shore of the St. Johns, but no one really knows exactly where the original was placed. Mayport is the easternmost part of the city of Jacksonville, though it once was a city in its own right. The area is the home of Naval Station Mayport, which includes both a naval air station and ship harbor that was once the home port of aircraft carriers. The naval station is also the home of two of Florida's lighthouses, the St. John's Light and St. John's River Light. The two towers are located less than 2 miles or 3 kilometers from each other, so they never operated at the same time. Built in 1858, this one, known as the River Light, was the third light built at the mouth of the St. John's. It was replaced by a lightship in 1929. The lightship was replaced in 1954 when the current St. John's Light was built. Neither light is open to the public since the naval station has restricted access. You can get close to the historic River Light as it's near the property fence. Note that the light was once 7 feet or 2 meters taller. The naval station raised the land around it since it's near the runway. If you could walk around the light, you'd see there's no door. It was buried and the only way in is a window 8 feet off the ground. As for the current St. John's Light, you may notice that this photo shows only the top of the light. As far as I can tell, the light is only visible from across the St. John's at this point and on the beach at the northern end of Atlantic Beach. Going back to the River Light, it's not only on the edge of the naval station, it's only a few blocks from the St. John's River Ferry. This is a car ferry service which travels the short distance between Mayport and the North Shore. The ferry connects to two segments of State Route A1A, the historic oceanfront road which runs from Key West north to Fernandina Beach and then briefly west to the town of Callahan. There's several interesting aspects to the ferry. 1. Even though A1A crosses over 100 bridges, including 42 just to get from Key West to Miami, you need the St. Johns River Ferry to stay on the road and get to the end of A1A. 2. If you're driving north to reach Fernandina Beach, you'll end up further south when you've taken the ferry. The Mayport dock is located north of the North Shore dock. 3. There's been a ferry here since 1874, likely the longest running boat service in the state. 4. It not only completes A1A, it's part of the East Coast Greenway, a pedestrian and cycling route between the Canadian border in Maine to Key West. The Greenway is working to use off-road paths on its 3,000-mile or 4,800-kilometer route. As of 2021, 35% of the Greenway is off-road, while in Florida it's 31%. 5. When you drive onto the ferry, you've entered the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. While it's operated by the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, the ferry is considered a part of the preserve and sometimes a park ranger is on board to answer questions. If you've used the ferry to cross the north side of the St. John's, it's easy to explore its mouth by heading to Huguenot Memorial Park. It's a Jacksonville City park on a small spit of land that surrounds the Fort George Inlet on the east side of Fort George Island. It's located on A1A just before you get to Little Talbot Island. The park is mostly sand dunes that form the shore of the St. John's at its end, as well as a bit of the Atlantic. It has a nice campground and beach access that takes you to the rock jetty which protects the river's entrance. We've now traveled the entire length of the river, from the Fort Drum Marsh near Yeehaw Junction to here at Mayport and Fort George Island. At this point, we've gone 310 miles or 499 kilometers, though it's only about 200 miles or 320 kilometers as the crow flies. We've also dropped just 30 feet or 9 meters from the source to the ocean. It encompasses 16 lakes, including the second largest in the state. Like most large rivers, it's important both economically and recreationally, and it has a significant history. Indigenous people who moved to the peninsula at least 14,000 years ago discovered that the area was a great place to live with plentiful game and fish, as well as lots of tasty edible plants. There are many archaeologically important sites nearby, ones that have taught us valuable information of hundreds of thousands of people who called Florida home for thousands of years. This was, of course, long before the Spanish named the land after the profusion of plants and the fact that they were in the Easter season. Pascua, Florida, in Spanish. Today the area has a huge amount of natural, relatively undeveloped places, but the river and all of Florida is under continuous threat from human-made forces like pollution and climate change. Much of the St. Johns is reasonably healthy, but for how long? The sheer amount of water that floods into the river from springs along its route helps clean it, but the Florida Aquifer, which sits just below the surface of the entire state, is also under attack. In 2019, the Associate Director of the Florida Springs Institute, Heather Obara, said, "We have a lot of overpumping of our aquifer, meaning that the demand for water in Florida is really high, and we are using more water than our aquifer can replenish itself. We have a lot of water usage here, such as large-scale agricultural usage, as well as urban residential usages that are depleting the aquifer at a rapid rate." I'm a historian, and I don't usually get into such issues, but think about Florida. What's the most important feature? The state averages 55 inches of rain every year. It's regularly shaped by hurricanes. It has 30,000 lakes, the Everglades, 731 springs, 33 of which produce more than 100 million gallons of water every day. When I'm showing the state to visitors, I often point out how every large road has ditches on either side, and there are thousands of retention ponds everywhere, all to keep the land dry enough for modern humans to live. There's an easy answer to my question. Florida's most important feature? Water.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Remember, subscribing is completely free. Soon I'll create one last video in this series, one which will be about a few of the important tributaries of the St. Johns, such as Blue Spring Run, the Silver River, and the Ocklawaha River. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.